for gender age with the resident fixed
Yes.
effects. And yes, you're right. It's controlled. The thing that I was saying was a suggestion for making you understand mm, what did the question here meant by stop sharing, sorry. Um, when it was saying if there are any measures that are missing in the literature. It was just an example. It was not to say, but you are right. They are already controlling for resident fixed effects, so it's already included in the analysis whether there are influences due to the person characteristics.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Thanks. Thanks for clarifying.
yeah, no worries. Are there other questions so far?
Oh,
Okay, then I would suggest to continue with the results section. Who wants to read now?
but I I think Ranit can't speak, so I'm happy
Yes,
to
I've seen in the chat.
continue.
Okay,
No
thank you.
worries. Uh, okay, I just realized I need to reopen it. Sorry. Here
Yeah,
we
no
go.
worries.
Okay, so it's opening.
Yeah, no worries.
With the results, you mean? It's not general discussion. It's the results of the first study, right? That's what we're.
Yes, so
Okay.
pages 786.
It's 317. Okay. Subject section 317 results. As shown in columns 1 and 4 of table 1, operational transparency increased citizen engagement, leading residents to submit more service requests and to submit them in more categories in the month following exposure to operational transparency than in the preceding month. Moreover, columns 2 and 5 demonstrate that although the increases in service requests and request categories were especially strong in the month immediately following residents' first experience with operational transparency, the effects persisted significantly 11 months after a resident's initial exposure, as documented in the online appendix. Overall, residents submitted an average of 59.8% more public service requests in 37.7% more categories following exposure to operational transparency. Although we identify a positive main effect of operational transparency on an individual's subsequent willingness to engage with government, it's possible that these effects depend on the level of responsiveness that an individual has experienced from the government during his or her interactions with it in the past. Columns 3 and 6 of Table 1 show that government responsiveness was associated with an increase in citizen engagement, such that residents whose requests were successfully resolved submitted more requests and in more categories, but the relationship was concave, such that resident engagement exhibited diminishing returns in responsiveness, respectively. We also observed a nonlinear interaction between government responsiveness and transparency. Transparency was associated with the greatest increases in subsequent engagement among residents who experienced government being responsive to their requests, with such residents submitting more requests and in more categories. But the benefits of transparencies were attenuated among people who experienced especially high levels of government responsiveness.
Okay, stop here.
Yeah.
So they are listing the results. This is good. And in this section, we don't need to put citations or anything unless we are speaking about interaction or this kind of stuff, but they are not. But I stopped you here because as for the figures, we need to be sure that also their tables are self-explanatory. So what I would like to do now is, before continuing reading the paper, have a look at the table that they have provided to understand whether it is clear what they are measuring and what are their findings. So when we analyze the table, the first thing that we need to do is we need to understand what is the dependent variable that they are measuring. And in this case, it's in the title. Operational transparency increases resident engagement. We understand that operational transparency is the dependent variable for them. And we need to understand what are the differences between monthly count and between the columns. So as you see, 1, 2, 3 is a monthly count, and 4, 5, 6 is a category count. If we remind the section with the measures, we should remember that monthly count and category count are two forms of transparency that have been no. Let me just go back to the reportings, the monthly reportings. Yeah. So so this table is not that clear as it should, because resident engagement is the dependent variable for them, and monthly count is the number of reportings that they had in a month, and the category count is the kind of reporting that they had in a month. Like if it was about graffiti, if it was about trash in the street, or if it was about anything else. So I think if we remind what the dependent variable is, monthly count and category count is a clear distinction. One problem in this table is that it's not well highlighted that resident engagement is the dependent variable for them. Then, before going to read the rest of the table, we need to read the notes to understand which codes they are using in this paper. So residents submit more service requests and across a broader array of categories after being exposed to operational transparency. This is just a sentence. Usually you don't find this kind of sentences summarizing the results, but for sure you find the asterisks meaning, even though it's quite common to see one asterisk with a significance. Usually one asterisk is a significant of 5%, whereas for a significance at 10%, we have a cross. So it's important to report it, but it depends. This rule depends a little bit on the journal. Some journals prefer using the crosses, others just sticking with the asterisks. So this is something that you need to verify before submission in the submission guidelines. And it doesn't matter if the submission guidelines is telling you which kind of code you want to use. You need always to report it after every table, even though I know it's redundant, because if you have 10 tables in a journal, you have under every table to report this thing. Um, but it's important to have it. They are also saying that these significances these results are relative to the baseline condition. So we already know that they are comparing every variable to a baseline condition that is before the implementation of the changes in the application. In this case, we don't have abbreviation used, but if we had, they should report them also in the notes. Now, what about the rest of the table? Do you think that it is self-explanatory?
So I think, can I make some observations?
Yes.
So I think the rest is more self-explanatory than the points you just mentioned around the dependent variable and so on. So the variables for which we have some coefficient estimates are written in italic, which is different to the other regression statistics, however you want to call this, the observations, R squared, and number of reporters. So that's quite clear to me. Then I think they are using 3 different models, the ones that they explained before, on 2 different dependent variables. And then you have columns 1 to 3 on the first dependent variable, and then 4 to 6 on the second one. So that is also more intuitive and self-explanatory.
Yeah, it's true. But I would say there are some information that are missing in this table.
Okay.
Even though it's clear what they are doing and what are their results, one thing that I would have liked to see is the variation in the R square across the models, because they are comparing 3 different situations with the same dependent variable. In the first model, they don't use a control and they don't use interaction. In the second column, in the second model for both dependent variables, they are showing how significances change when including first transparency month indicator. And in the third column, they are introducing these interactions terms. This means that they are showing you 3 alternative models to support their arguments. And this is good. It's fine because they have high significances in all of them. But if you have a look for transparency, you have a positive value in the first column, a positive coefficient in the first column, a positive coefficient in the second column, and a negative coefficient in the third column. So it's changing direction, which means that we now need to understand which of these 3 models is more reliable. And even though in the third column you have more controls and more elements that are significant, so we could say we could be confident in saying, well, if we control for the other variables, we can better explain the relationship between transparency and resident engagement. We would like also to know whether this third model is actually better than the former ones, or if it's just a statistical artifact. And with a statistical artifact, it means that you are just adding controls or other variables sparsely just to increase the significances in your model. Also, there is another point that is important, and here comes also the question that Jose was doing in the morning, when do we normalize? If you have a look at the interaction terms, transparency per percentage closed and transparency per percentage closed square, you see that every coefficient has a quite small, um, is quite small because it's below. In the first models, it's always below 1. And in the third model, you have transparency that is -6. And then you have transparencies per percentage closed that is 18. And then you have per percentage closed that is -10. This means that there might be problems of multicollinearity in this study. And that they had to normalize the data, or well, to center their data to have more reliable estimates. So these are the couple of things that I would have looked at in the review process, and that you should take care when you are presenting a table. First, if you have more than one model, you need to ensure or to be convincing that your third model is better than model 1 and 2. And second, you have to be sure that your estimates are reliable. Okay, we can go ahead.
Sure. Whereas residents who experienced the government to be perfectly responsive to their requests exhibited significant gains in engagement after exposure to transparency, the gains from transparency were strongest among residents who experienced their government to be responsive but not perfect. By contrast, under relatively low levels of responsiveness relative to the baseline, transparency was associated with reduced levels of citizen engagement engagement. Note that because of the manner in which transparency was operationalized in our analysis, all residents who experienced transparency had at least one request successfully resolved. We present these results graphically in Figure 3. The figure demonstrates a consistent pattern wherein operational transparency increases engagement among residents who had experienced the government to be at least moderately responsive in the past.
Okay, here, let's stop it one moment. For two reasons. First, let's have a look at the table that they are proposing. One thing that they didn't do in this study, bless you, and that is a bit disappointing, is that when you have an interaction, you need to conduct a simple slope analysis to understand where the direction of the interaction changes. Because interactions are hypotheses or moderations, are hypotheses that are telling you these relationship becomes stronger when there is another variable involved. So the relationship between transparency and customer engagement becomes stronger when percentage closed is high rather than low. Or you can also say the relationship between transparency and engagement is positive when percentage closed is high, but becomes negative when percentage closed is low. This means that you need, when every time that you have an interaction, you need to add another analysis after the interaction to explain what are the mechanisms behind this interaction. So let's see if their figure at least try to address this gap. So, or maybe I can give you an example, a more concrete example of what an interaction is, of what a simple slope analysis is, before going ahead. Okay, so a simple slope analysis should look like this one. In this, this is another paper, so it's not related to what we have seen so far, but they are investigating basically the individual intrapreneurship behavior, how it is related to to a measure of performance for the employee, and how this relationship is moderated by agile task work, they call it. This is an understanding of the task that the employee have to perform. And they are explaining in the notes what is the code that they are using. So they are explaining to you that the moderator, that is agile task work, when employees understand similarly the task that they have to perform, they are using a continuous below the ground. I mean, they are using a dotted line. So the dotted line means that this moderator for them is high, and the dashed line, no, the dashed line means that it is high, and the continuous line means that this is low agile task work. And they are showing you that there is a positive relationship between the employee entrepreneurship and his performance. So the employee tendency to suggest ideas and the performance of the employee when the task is understood similarly to his colleagues. Whereas the relationship becomes negative when agile task work for them, so the task that they have to perform is perceived in a different way relative to their colleagues, so it's less similar. This is what I mean when I say you have to perform a simple slope analysis, because you see, the relationship is always the same. It's a relationship between entrepreneurship in this case and performance, but in certain cases, this relationship is positive. In other cases, this relationship becomes negative, and you cannot know it if you don't perform this kind of analysis. Is it clear? Guys, was that clear? Okay. So let's have a look at the figure. Operational transparency increased the predicted incremental monthly submission among residents who, in the past, had experienced at least a moderate level of responsiveness from the government. In this figure, they are reporting the significance levels, and we can see that when responsiveness is low, it doesn't matter whether there is transparency or a lack of transparency in the number of monthly submissions. And they're showing that when responsiveness for the government becomes higher, from higher than 70%, there is a significant difference between transparency and lack of transparency in that, and this relationship is curvilinear, in that from 70 to 80, there is a huge increase in the number of submissions in the transparent group relative to the non-transparent group. So here they are supporting their hypothesis. From 90 to 100%, we still see that there is this effect, but it becomes less of a lesser magnitude. Okay, this is another way to present the results, but still they should have reported at least one table with the differences and another kind of graph to represent the interaction. Is it clear why?
At least on the last part, on the why they should have presented the interaction, that wasn't quite clear to me. I think I understand that graph now, but I'm not really sure what is missing here from your point of view. Sorry.
So, yeah, no worries. We are here for that. So here they found another way to represent the interaction effect. The problem in this graph is that they have chosen some points. They have chosen in responsiveness 60, 70, 80, 90, and 100%, and they are not showing it in a continuous manner when exactly there is the change from the increase in the number of submission in the transparency conditions relative to when this change is smaller and less significant. Because you see, in 60%, this change, there is no difference between the two groups. Starting from 70% is when we start to see that there is an effect. And then they are also showing you, but they are not discussing it, that this change is increasing up to 80% in this figure, but it's the difference between the control group that is non-transparency and the treatment group that is transparency become smaller. This is why I'm saying this graph is giving the idea, but is not the most appropriate in this to this analysis. And usually what you have when you have an interaction effect is a graph as the one that I showed you before, combined with a table representing the points and the points, the relationship, and the significances. With the free numbers after the comma. Here we can just see the asterisks. We cannot see how these are changing. Okay. Let's go ahead with the robustness test.
Sure. Robustness test. As described earlier, the as-if random nature of the assignment of photographs in this field data is important in interpreting our results, because if, for example, city workers chose to post photographs only for requests that were resolved more satisfactorily, it may have been the elevated quality of responses that included a photograph and not the provision of operational transparency itself that led to increased resident engagement. To test the robustness of our results to this possibility, we exploit a feature of the data that allows us to break this potential endogeneity. Specifically, observing operational transparency through Citizens Connect required that the resident had a request closed by a public works team that posted a photograph, and that the resident had a version of the app that supported seeing that photograph. Although the new version of Citizens Connect diffused rapidly for 18.05% of the resident month observations corresponding with first-time service requests that were resolved with a photograph, the resident did not, as of the time he or she submitted the request, have a version of the app that supported transparency. By including separate indicator variables in our specifications that control for whether the resident had ever made a request that was closed with a photograph, whether the resident had a version of the app that supports observing transparency, and whether the resident had ever made a request with a version of the app that supports transparency that was closed with a photograph, we are able to make the provision of operational transparency exogenous to both the resident and the worker. By doing so, we can separately analyze whether the effects we observe arise from selection effects or from the provision of operational transparency itself. This analysis requires two caveats, both of which bias against finding support for operational transparency. First, we cannot directly observe from our data when a user updated their app. We can only observe which version of the app they had when they submitted each service request. As such, even if a resident didn't have a version of the app that supported transparency when he or she submitted a request that was ultimately closed with a photograph, it doesn't mean that the resident didn't experience transparency after receiving an updated version of the app. Indeed, updates to the app diffused rapidly, and under this specification, any effects attributable to observing operational transparency after receiving the update would be credited to the indicator variable for whether the worker posted a photograph or not to the treatment variable itself, thus biasing against observing an effect. Second, identification to carry out this analysis comes from a narrow subset of the observations, which diminishes its statistical power. Nevertheless, as shown in Table 2, the effects documented earlier are generally robust when these controls are included, reinforcing the primary conclusions that operational transparency promoted increased engagement among residents, especially among those for whom the government had been at least moderately responsive.
Okay. So let's go to our critique. There are 3 questions here, quite simple. Are results clearly presented and discussed? I would say yes. They are showing the kind of analysis that they have done. And even though there are some problems in the table that they had, they are in the writing part. It's clear the explanation that they are giving. They are explaining, and they are also discussing the additional analysis that they have performed with the data and what are the problems in the robustness tests. Are the tables self-explanatory without the need of reading the text in detail? Well, I would say also here, they are relatively self-explanatory. Of course, you cannot pretend to be able to interpret this table without understanding what they mean with transparency. So, or what they need with a monthly count. So maybe they could make an improvement here, and in the note at least explaining what exactly monthly and the category count refers to, so that one don't need to go through the paper for understanding the difference between these two dependent variables. But apart from that, they are quite self-explanatory. So it's a good way of presenting results. Are the results in line with the predictions or unexpected new? Also, in this case, they didn't really formulate the hypothesis, so we cannot really answer this question because it's an exploratory study. And since there are no specific predictions, we can say they are in line with the prediction that there is a relationship indeed between transparency and engagement, but they didn't formulate it explicitly. So for this point, this study is a bit particular in the sense that they are using exploration rather than hypothesis formulation. And this is something that usually you don't do during your doctoral studies.
Can I ask a question related to this?
Yes, yes.
Because for my paper too, I got feedback on a conference that we should move towards an exploratory analysis instead of hypothesis-driven research. That is based on the fact that we have multiple features that we want to analyze. And they say, don't limit yourself to just a couple of features, but try to analyze as much as possible, and then frame it like, hey, these are the most relevant ones, the 5 most relevant ones, but we also found effects for 10 other ones. Now I was a bit surprised when you said you probably won't do this approach in your PhD thesis. And I just wanted to get your rationale behind why you were saying that.
So I think that for you, the team is a little bit different. The point is that in an exploratory study, you need to be really acquainted with how research works before deciding to engage in something completely new. Having said that, once you have started collecting your data, it's frequent that reviewers or people you are approaching tell you to use an exploratory case. But this is something that comes after you have started your study. You don't start a study by saying, I want to conduct an exploratory study. It's just that during your research, you realize that there are more variables that can participate in the discourse that you are trying to join. This is something that comes, I mean, you don't structure your paper to be an exploratory study. You start with an idea, you reason about the theories, you start collect the data and analyze which are the possible variables affecting your study, and then they tell you, well, there might be other factors that are affecting your results, and you could explore them given the data that you have.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's exactly what happened. Cool. Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
so that's what I was saying. That's why I was saying usually you don't do that in your PhD, at least when you are at the beginning, because you first need to get experience with what is writing a paper, and writing exploratory studies. It's difficult because they are easy to distract.
Got it.
So usually you start from a base. You need to start from a base, at least to demonstrate that you have knowledge around the topic.
Okay.
And then you can start to build on this knowledge.
Okay.
But it's a second step.
Understood. Thanks. That makes it clearer.
Okay, so who wants to continue to read? Let's go to the second study.
Well, I assume if we go on in that manner, it's my turn.
So, well,
should I? I mean, I have to. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you can, but let's wait just a moment. I suggest. Let me figure out. Since you have already started to understand how to evaluate these parts, that you read by yourself the two studies that are coming up. And we meet again in 1 hour to discuss what you have found, if it's clear, the study, if there are other variables that are confounding. So basically you answer the questions on the method and results for the two further studies. And we discuss them together in 1 hour, in about 1 hour, so that we can then continue with the discussion part that we didn't try to explore it together. Sounds good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Good.